Okay, continuing on with my woodworking adventures, making the frame for the Riley. I'm getting to the point where at the moment everything is just kind of clamped together. There's clamps and boards, and I've used string and tape and all sorts of things just to temporarily figure out where everything needs to go. I was working from my CAD model, but that is not 100% accurate because I can't get 100% accuracy on modeling the chassis, which everything's built on top of. It's pretty close, but what I'm finding is in practice I'm needing to tweak things, which is pretty much how I expected it was going to work. I did think I had something wrong. I thought I had the bottom rail too short because I was having trouble positioning the door. I think I've mentioned before, probably hundreds of times, that the only original bit of Riley Brooklands body I've got is this door skin. And what I'm actually doing is using that to kind of figure out how everything goes. And between that and all the reference material I've got, I think I've got it sorted out now. Again, not all the cars are 100% the same. There is some variation in them, it seems. But this is a car that actually used to be in New Zealand, 8079, which is a very original Riley Brooklands. And this one recently came up for sale. And I keep an eye on the internet and on the different pre-war car sites just to see what's around and see what comes up for sale. And anytime a car is advertised, I grab all of the pictures. I've got a personal library of reference material that I have. And this car recently came up for sale, and there are some very excellent high-res pictures of it online. So I've been using those to verify what I'm doing and how everything fits. And I'm really getting into the fine details now, like how the door works and how the door skin overlaps. It's a bit hard to see. This is just I've only got a black and white laser printer, but if you actually look at things like the door skin, which is a little bit rusty, but this actually shows you how it's constructed. So obviously there's a timber frame, and you can see on the end here and the top, the metal of the door skin wraps around the timber. Same along that curved edge, but along the bottom edge and the back edge, it's folded over. And that is so that the body, which is in two halves, pick this up, it's a bit hard to do with one hand. The body is constructed in two halves. So you've got the front half, which ends here, and then the rear half, the tail. And the door skin, that flat folded edge, is what goes up against the back half of the body to give you that flat line on the door. And then the rest of the way around, it kind of has to match the top of the scuttle all along here. And what I'd found is I'd taken my measurements off my CAD model and they weren't quite right. So it was pushing the door too far back that way. And I realized, well, if I take the measurements directly off the door, I can figure out where the front hinge pillar goes, and I can make sure that the scuttle and the door all line up. And that's what I've done. And then I can confirm at the back where the back of the front half of the body is, and that there is just that little bit of overlap. It's about 1/2 inch of overlap, which is where it'll join onto the second, or overlap the second half of the body, the back half. And I can use things like the suspension mounts and the rivets for the cross members as reference points. And that's what I've been able to do with pictures like this to get this as close as I can, knowing that this car has a very original body and chassis. So I'm at the point where I actually need to start screwing bits of timber together. I kind of want to keep everything as loose as possible because that helps me measure things and figure out how to cut the pieces of timber. So at the moment, obviously, everything is just clamped in place. But I'm going to need to start screwing it together. Otherwise, it's all just too flimsy. You can't just keep clamping bits and pieces together and expect it all be true. I need to start solidifying some of these joins, and I'm actually going to start at this front one here. And what I did there is I've done a lap type joint, half lap I think it's called. But recently someone I know in the UK, Jim, very kindly filmed his original Brooklands body that he's got that's off the car at the moment. So he was able to film that and show me an awful lot of the actual details on how these are built. And seeing it in film really cleared up a lot of the details that I've been puzzling over in all of the reference photos that I've got. Seeing it in moving pictures made it a lot clearer what was going on. And it also shows exactly how crude these bodies were. I actually have to be careful, even with my limited woodworking skills, that I don't overdo it, because they were pretty rough from the factory. And once you start looking really closely at the details, you can really see that. And they were very, very simply constructed. So, you know, I was considering having to do lapped joints and I can't remember what the names of all the joints are, you know, actually setting pieces of wood into each other and that kind of thing. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that from the factory. So, for example, this top piece here, it's just screwed in. It's just a butt joint. And then they use metal brackets everywhere to reinforce things. So I'm basically just going to go with how they did it at the factory because it's a replica. And that obviously works. And it's the simplest way to build it. So I need to concentrate on not overthinking it. I mean, I still want everything to be accurate. And the way I'm constructing it probably isn't the most efficient way, but it means it gives me the best chance of getting everything accurate and correct. So, for example, what I mean there is between here, which is where the instrument panel would go, and here, which is the firewall, I know exactly what that distance needs to be. I can measure that. And these two hoops are parallel to each other. So there is a slope on the scuttle, of course. It was actually a slight curve. I'm being very careful to get these lines correct because you want that line across the scuttle down to the bonnet to the front of the radiator to be nice. You don't want any sort of kinks or bumps or anything in it. It just doesn't look right. The Brooklands is very nicely curved across there. So because these are slightly different heights, this piece of timber is effectively, it's not horizontal, it's actually on a little angle. And I guess one way you could do that is you could make a piece of timber and cut the ends on the angles that you need. But because I'm going to have to shape all of this anyway, all I'm going to do is make everything kind of oversized, if that's the sensible way to put it. The bandsaw is set up to cut everything very square. So when I butt join these, this will be at 90 degrees. And because this is slightly higher than that, it means the timber will be sticking up a little bit here. But that's fine because I need to plane everything off and sand everything off to give me the curves I need. So what I will do is this will be screwed to the frames, but it'll be a little bit high, and then I can run my edge all the way along it and actually trace the curve I need and then trim it to match. And that's the same as what's going on here. This is just clamped to give me the right spacing at the moment, but this will have to be angled so that this is flat because that makes the sits above the door. So this is the top of the door, so obviously it's parallel to that. And I can do the same thing here. So this will be obviously turned round so it's flat, and I can trace out the shape that I need by actually measuring it off the body to give me the exact curve that I need to create. That's the theory anyway. We'll have to see how that goes. It's probably a slightly wasteful way of doing it, but I think I'm onto my second board now. And I got 6 or 7 of them, I think, initially. So I'm looking pretty good in terms of how much timber I've got. And there aren't really that many pieces of timber in this. So my MDF mock-up there was actually fairly accurate in terms of the number of bits of timber. So you've got the two hoops. This hoop obviously doesn't go all the way down because of the door mountings. So I've just got temporary MDF screwed on there, screwed in at a point where those screw holes will get cut off. So this is where this horizontal piece will go. That makes the door opening. You can sort of see that all kind of lines up. Obviously that bottom lip of the door overlaps at the bottom there, and then I'll need to put in the pillars that go from here up, and that'll be done in a similar way, where I'll have it sticking out a little bit and I'll trim it to fit the curve I need. I'll be able to mark it up and then trim it and then put it back together. I'm going to hold off gluing anything for as long as possible, so I'll just try to hold it together with the wood screws for now. And that's where I realized my changing tack to use the much simpler jointing methods. So instead of lapping everything, it's all just butt joints, means I don't have long enough screws. So I've had to order new screws, because now I'm going to have to screw through the whole width of that to get it to work. Between all the reference photos I've got and the film that Jim made, I can see where most of the little metal brackets and bits and pieces go. And also on the body that Jim's got, there's lots of triangular blocks. Literally blocks screwed into corners like this to help reinforce everything. I think I have made my framing pieces a little bit fat, but again, that was on purpose because I need to trim them down to get the smooth curves that I need. So for example, down here, you can see that corner's overlapping because eventually that all gets trimmed back to give me the curves. So that's where I'm at the moment. I think the next thing I have to do is actually screw these joints together, these bottom ones, and then I can start building up from there. The other thing I'm going to have to do is figure out where the holes go. So there are effectively special sort of coach bolts that go completely through this rail into the chassis rail. That's what actually bolts the body to the chassis. I'm not sure exactly how many there are. I think it's 3 per side. At least 2, because I've seen those in the photos. I think there's sort of one there and one up here somewhere and then another one. But again, I'll just try and get that as close to original as possible, I think. So I'm being very careful with what I'm doing, checking everything multiple times to make sure it's correct. That's why I'm going fairly slowly. I suspect if you actually knew what you were doing and you'd done this before and you had patterns, you could put one of these bodies together pretty quickly, which I imagine is what they were doing at the factory. When you look at the finish on some of them, it was pretty rough. For example, at the back, there's little metal, it's kind of like a flat plate with a thick tube welded to it and a screw that goes through it. And those are the mountings for the rear guards. So the guard stays are sort of round bar that poke through the body, and they just clamp into these things because they used to be able to take the guards off for racing. And those are extremely crude. I've seen pictures of those from several cars now, and they're not pretty at all. They're very functional, but yeah, they're not exactly precision-made bits of kit. So that's where I'm at the moment. It's the weekend now, Sunday afternoon, and been playing with the woodworking on this most of the weekend, with little breaks to little bits and pieces on the bike and a few other things. I ended up screwing the front hoop and gluing it to the rails at the bottom. I realized if I just tried to hold it with screws, it was probably going to be too weak and I'll end up ruining the joints and the screw holes. And that the only way to really get everything set up is to actually start building it on the chassis. It's going to make it a little bit more of a pain because now it's one big piece I have to keep putting on and off if I want to do things on it. So I have to be a bit more careful about how I actually attach different bits and pieces. But I think ultimately it'll work better this way because I can make sure everything is correct as I'm putting it on the car. So you can see at the moment, I've just got the temporary legs on the bottom of the instrument panel hoop. And I've cut a piece of timber to go in there, and I'm just going to butt join that. So I'm waiting, I've ordered longer screws now, so I'll just be able to screw straight through from the ends. It keeps it all really nice and easy. And it also occurred to me it's the easiest way for me to make sure I keep all the joints and things square, because it's pretty easy to cut the ends of the pieces of timber square. I find that the bandsaw is set up accurately enough that if I cut something on that, it ends up completely square. So I can just go with the cut joints. For the side pieces, so there's a piece that goes across here and then a vertical, and that's where the door hinges attach. And the two sides of the car aren't symmetrical because the doors are different lengths. To get that piece across there, the first thing I tried was just cutting a wider piece of timber. And I have those over here. I kind of messed this up a little bit, so these are wasted pieces of wood, which I'm sure I'll reuse somewhere else. So they effectively go in there like that. And I thought by cutting the ends parallel, I can then just trim it to fit. But these are actually too short. It's just a little bit hard to tell when you've got it like that. I could have gone back to my model on my computer, but I went back to the old-fashioned version of CAD and basically made a cardboard template, which kind of fits in that way up, sort of like that. So what I ended up doing was, I have the vertical pieces modeled and they're fairly accurate. So I cut out the vertical pieces and then I sat it on the chassis rail on either side, and I used this template, made this template. And then from that, I cut, I'm sitting down here because the glue's still drying. I cut these pieces out for the bottoms, and these are the vertical pieces. And then I realized I actually had a problem, which was joining these onto these rails. I could just screw down from the top, but then I have that problem, which is the direction that the grain's running. So this has got long grain going this way, but as it curves around, of course, it starts going into going the wrong way round, effectively. So what I was worried about is if I screwed into that, it'll just split this. So in the end, I decided to join it with a one of these splice joints or spline joints. I've seen them called both things, but it's a bit like a biscuit joint, I guess. So I already had the router set up to cut the slots in the end of the vertical pieces, and then all I needed was a way to cut the slots into here. And the way I ended up doing that was, this is my little test setup. I figured out what the distance is on the router between the edge of the fence or the edge of the base and the center of the cutter. Turns out to be 55 millimeters. And I worked out I can use one of these wooden clamps and hold everything in place. I can measure where I want the slot, hold it all in place, and then I can run the, oops, the router's not plugged in. I can just run the router across like that to make the slot I need. And the really cool thing about doing it this way is I can make the slot fractionally bigger to make sure it really fits the piece of timber that I fit in there. And this has worked really well. I may end up using the same style of doing joints on things in other places. Again, this is where the order of doing things becomes really important, because I'm able to do that on these pieces because they're not attached to the frame. If they were attached to the frame, it would make it a lot harder to do that. So those joints then I will probably still screw down from the top, but probably just a longer single screw. These are all clamped up. I can make them a very, very tight fit because I can make the little joiner piece exactly the right width to make it a good tight push fit in there. And then I can clamp the sides of it. That's one of the things I like about these, is you can put pressure on the sides really easily with these clamps, and I've got pressure going down just with the weights on top of it. This glue dries pretty quick, but it says it takes 24 hours to get to full strength. But I think that should be fine like that. I'll leave that overnight. So with those in place, that's more or less the front section finished. There's not a lot to it. I have some plywood on order, and there is actually a wooden firewall that goes on here. It's cut slightly in as well, which is what gives you the little lip that the rubber strip. So firewall comes out here, and then there's a sort of rubber joining strip, and that's what the bonnet rests on all the way around. That firewall is kind of cut out and goes across. You can actually see Austin 7, I think. There's sort of rubber strip like this. My bonnet's not actually latched down at the moment. And that's what the bonnet sits on to get that all nice and flush. And I also ordered some steel so I can start making all the little corner brackets and little bits and pieces that need to go in there. The other thing I'm looking at is the instrument panel, which I'm guessing just goes in here. I'm not sure if it sits on the back or if it comes forward a little bit. On the Brooklands as well, there's a padded, sort of a pad that goes all the way around the cockpit opening. It sort of attaches onto here, goes all the way around the top of the doors, up the back, and I think it even goes around the back of the seat back frame. So I've left enough room for that. And then it'll just need shaping. So, I mean, you can see down here how this is just straight. So that whole corner needs to come off, of course. It needs to be round, curved round. I was worried that this was starting to get a little bit thin here, but I made these quite a bit oversized. So that's not too thin. That'll actually save quite a bit of weight. So that's the front section done. And then it's going to be similar for doing the tail, I guess. Again, it's just some hoops and flat piece that goes across the chassis. The opening for the rear axle here, there's actually a piece of metal that goes all the way up, comes up the sides, bends in a little bit, and then comes up and over and down and back down the other side to strengthen that whole cutout. And then, of course, obviously there's the boot lid opening that goes in here somewhere. I can't remember exactly where it goes. Look at my pictures. But that's all. It shouldn't be too hard to do. I think there is a little bit more involved. I can't remember how many. I think I've only got one other hoop that goes on the back. But I guess I just do it the same way. It's slowly getting a bit easier, and I'm slowly starting to get the hang of it, but it is taking me a lot longer because I've never done it before, I guess. So that's where we're at on this.